Değerli izleyiciler, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün İstanbul Mimar Sinan Güzel Sanatlar Üniversitesi Şehir ve Bölge Planlama Bölümü, Sel Yayıncılık ve Şehir Plancıları Odası İstanbul Şubesi'nin işbirliğinde gerçekleştireceğimiz birazdan bir organizasyonda hep beraberiz. Bugünkü konuğumuz hepinizin, Türkiye'deki okurların kitaplarından ve aktivist kimliğinden çok yakından tanıdığı Sayın David Harvey. Kendisini üniversitemizde ağırlamaktan büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Birazdan kendisi konferansına başlayacak. Diğer bir mutluluğumuz da kendisinin son çalışması olan 2014 yılında yazdığı 17 Çelişki ve Kapitalizmin Sonu isimli kitabın Türkçe'ye çok kısa bir sürede çevrilmiş olması. Ve bu kitabın ilk defa yine okuyucularla buluşması üniversitemiz ortamında gerçekleşiyor. Bu açıdan da çok büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Ben hepinize öncelikle geldiğiniz için teşekkür ediyorum. Ve tabii en büyük teşekkür de bizlerle birlikte olduğu için Sayın David Harvey'e. Çok teşekkürler.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and coming out and on a nice day. I want to thank my publisher, Sel, very much, not only for this translation, but for several translations which they have done. And I want to thank the Chamber of Planning also for helping to stage this event. And I really appreciate the effort put in. Marx once said, when he was asked what he was up to in his studies of capital, was that he said he was preparing a terrible missile to be hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie and the landlords. I think that is actually one of the reasons why Marx and Marx's works are so dangerous, is precisely because they have that quality to them. And when I prepared the manuscript of 17 Contradictions, my publisher friend, who's actually helped publish most of my books in English, who's always been a great supporter of my work, but never an uncritical supporter, he remarked that he thought this book was perhaps the most important one I'd ever written. And I was thinking afterwards, having thanked him for his vote of confidence, I was thinking afterwards that maybe it's the most dangerous book I've ever written, for a variety of reasons which I want to get into. But it also happens to be a book that comes at the end of a whole sequence of books, which in retrospect I refer to as the Marx Project. Now I say in retrospect because I had no idea when I started that it was going to turn into this project. And it's only in the last couple of years I've realized that this is what I've been doing. In effect, the project has, in a funny sort of way, taken over my life. It began towards the end of the 1990s. And I was actually looking forward to the year 2000 because it was supposed to be the year of my retirement. And I was really quite looking forward to going off and doing what the hell I liked. So here I am 15 years later, 12 books later. My God, what happened? Something strange happened. One of the strange things that happened was that I moved to the City University of New York in 2001. And I moved from a private university with a lot of misery and pain, and went to a public institution which was actually concerned with creating a public. And to the degree that it's a public university and pays lower salaries than the most famous universities in New York, which are Columbia and NYU, City University of New York has faculty that by and large neither Columbia nor NYU would ever care to hire. So the result is there's a bunch of radicals in CUNY, which turns out to be a very nice atmosphere. And of course, it's a huge university. It has nearly 500,000 students. Nobody knows that, but we do. We have a graduate school, which is actually very active and politically active. So I suddenly found myself in this new environment with some fabulous students who took over the idea that if I was going to teach capital to, say, 100 people in a lecture, it might just as well put it on the web. So it was their idea to create the website. It was their idea to film the Marx book, the Marx lectures, which have been actually quite influential worldwide. And so I owe them a great deal of thanks. They also did some marvelous things. I'm not very competent with the new media technologies. So I remember at some point somebody said, "We follow you on Twitter." And I said, "What? I don't have a Twitter." And they said, "Yes, you do." And they showed me. But of course, it was my students who were twittering on my behalf. So if any of you following me on Twitter, you know it's them, not me. So this was a rather wonderful experience. But it also occurred to me, of course, that Marx, it seems to me, has been very badly understood. And in part, of course, this comes from all the right-wing distortions and the like. Part of it also comes from simple ignorance and fear of communism or Marxism or whatever. Some of it, unfortunately, also comes from the left because there are some, I think, very dogmatic readings of Marx in the history of Marxism, which did not seem to me to work very well with the texts that I was teaching. And so it seemed to me that there was a very good case for trying to lay out a more accessible approach to Marx. And I emphasize the more accessible because there is a lot of Marx scholarship in the academy. Much of it seems to be dedicated to making Marx even more complicated than he already is. And while I think there's a lot to admire in some of that, it seems to me that working on Marx in that way misses the point. So what I wanted to do in the lectures and in the companions to Marx's Capital, what I wanted to do was to sort of open a door, as it were, to Marx's thinking, so that people could go through that and work out for themselves what it was that they would want to take out of this text. And I had learned from teaching it to multiple audiences, including people in prison, that different people took different things out of it, and in many respects, what they took out of it was equally valid. That is, a philosopher reading Marx sees different things in it than a sociologist or a social worker, and academics see something different than social movement people. And I think that's okay. I don't think there's one reading of Marx that needs to be sustained. So it was in that spirit that we put the lectures on the web. inviting people to read the texts, and then the written versions came out as companions, and I thought the word companion as opposed to introduction was very important. It's like I wanted to be somebody's companion walking through this text, not saying to them, this is what you've got to believe, but hey, what do you see? How do you see it? What does it look like? How do you understand things? And that, of course, was just part of what the Marx project was about. But also in teaching these texts, I'd always been very concerned with some very important questions. And perhaps one of the most important questions was, what is it that we can actually learn from Marx? And what is it that we have to do for ourselves in order to understand the world around us? That is, there is a distinction, it seems to me, between what Marx managed to accomplish and how he managed to accomplish it. And I'm profoundly admiring of that. And how we use that information, those ideas, to interpret and understand where we are right now. And this poses certain problems of figuring out in what respects Marx's ideas are dated back to the mid-19th century, to what degree we need to introduce new elements. And as Marx and Engels wrote in their introduction to the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, any historical materialist has to go back to the beginning and reevaluate everything that is said back then for what the situation is right now. And that seemed to me to be an important part of teaching the text, to say, well, this is what Marx said at the time, this is how he saw it, and this is in relationship to the things that were going on around him at the time. He didn't see certain things that are going on around us, so we now have to think about how we approach that text and bring it into our present. And in this sense, it seemed to me very important to construe Marxism as a living tradition. It's not a dead scriptural reading of the gospel according to Karl Marx. It is a living tradition, and it is to bring life into it that it seemed to me to be absolutely crucial to teach it that way. But in teaching it that way, not only to ask that big question, what is it that Marx can do for us, and what is it that we have to do for ourselves, to be able also to think through certain issues which Marx left unfinished and which needed to be updated, and to think through also how certain elements within Marx's text do indeed resound with us today in very, very clear ways. I became very impressed in the 1990s, the more globalization and neoliberalization and all the rest of it became significant, that the reports on labor processes in Bangladesh or in Mexico or in Indonesia or in China, that you could take those reports and you could put them into Marx's chapter on the working day and you would not see any difference. That is, there was a sense in which the movement of history after 1970 or so was moving capital back closer and closer to that kind of world which Marx described. That the length of the working day, which was absolutely crucial in Marx's analysis, was becoming more and more significant. When I was working in Baltimore on the living wage campaign, I was talking with people who were working 80-hour weeks in order to get enough income to survive. I was talking to people who had absolutely no time for political organization, had no time to think, whose time was completely taken up, both in the living space and in the workspace, by designated tasks for which they became exhausted at the end of every working day. So when you come to this, you would say, there are things going on as we would go through Capital that you suddenly have these light bulbs and say, yes, it's exactly like that now. The creation of industrial reserve armies, the creation of disposable populations, which Marx talks about in Volume 1 of Capital. These were, I think, very significant. So one of the things I also tried to do, not only in teaching Marx, was to try to illustrate how the understanding that I had of Marx as laid out in the 2 volumes of the Companions to Capital helped me to dissect, deconstruct, understand many of the issues that were going on around us. So I wrote a book about the new imperialism. I wrote about the history of neoliberalism. I wrote about the enigma of capital. I wrote about the 17 contradictions, in all of which I was really using the conceptual apparatus that Marx uses, but adapted that conceptual apparatus to try to dissect what is happening in contemporary capitalism and how contemporary capitalism works. At the same time, I was also following a lifelong interest in urbanization. So there were 3 books on urbanization. The book on Spaces of Hope, the Paris book, of course, and Rebel Cities. And all of those books were teaching me things about Marx's conceptual apparatus, which either validated the conceptual apparatus or said, this conceptual apparatus doesn't work very well. So the question then arose, how can we make the conceptual apparatus operate more effectively? How can we design it more effectively? So it was like a perpetual dialogue going on between the conceptual theoretical apparatus on the one hand and the investigation into questions of urban dynamics, uneven geographical development, imperialism, neoliberalism, and the like. And it's that conversation which became very significant that led me in many ways to start to reconfigure my understanding of Marx in relationship to contemporary concerns. But Marx is such an interesting study because you come up with an empirical idea on the basis of something like the Paris study, and you see something happening and you say, oh, well, that's theoretically very important. And then you go back into Marx and you find, actually, he talked about that. You just didn't see it when you were reading it theoretically. And so this then became another part of what I was talking about. Now, each one of these books had a particular target. Neoliberalism, obvious target. Imperialism, another obvious target. The enigma of capital was built around the question, what happened in 2007, 2008? How do we interpret the crisis then? And the urban books, obviously, had their own particular targets. So this brings me to the question, what was my target in 17 Contradictions? And why, in pursuing that target, did I create a book that I think is actually quite dangerous? The target was really twofold. First, I wanted to define what it might mean to be anti-capitalist. I found myself in an environment in which a lot of people would say, oh, I'm anti-capitalist. Yeah, I'm anti-capitalist. I don't want to be called communist. That's too messy. And besides, you might get your head chopped off in the wrong parts of the world for that. So I'll just say I'm anti-capitalist. And then if you ask people what they meant by that, they give you a vague answer. So it seemed to me important to try to define, all right, what does it really mean to be anti-capitalist? And then I wanted to go one step further is I wanted to actually do a study of capital to show why it would be rational for everybody to be anti-capitalist. Why it is rational for you to be anti-capitalist. And I say rational because this is not based on emotion or anything like that. It's based on an analysis. And in this sense, I do still cling to the idea of Marx as a scientist trying to really understand the nature of the world we live in, and to trying to do it not in a scientistic way, but in, I think, a very clear and very measured way. So I wanted to do those two things, and the question then arose, how best to do that? I decided to do it by looking at the notion of contradiction. And here too, it seemed to me there was something that needed to be cleared up. Marxists are very fond of talking about contradictions. But actually it turns out, again, this is a sort of a bit of a problematic concept. There are certain contradictions of capital that are well known. Capital, labor, productive forces versus social relations. And there's a tendency always to sort of mention those as being the great destabilizers of what capital is about. But beyond that, there are always these kinds of other issues that arise. And one of the things that I had noticed over the years, and in fact, I had indulged in this myself, was that when you encountered something you couldn't understand or didn't make any sense whatsoever, you would just throw up your hands and say, well, it's the contradictions of capital, isn't it? And everybody would say, oh, yeah, okay. And it was like a conversation stopper. And I thought, actually, we should take the idea of contradiction and make it a conversation starter, in which we would ask the question, what are the contradictions which we face? So I did what I've done before, which is to sort of whiz through the 3 volumes of Capital and go through my notes on the theories of surplus value and all the rest of it. And I came up with, I have to say, rather more than 17 contradictions that Marx talks about. So I decided, rather than talk about 57 contradictions, that I'd try to configure what it seemed to me were the main ones which were significant, and some of the contradictions actually merge into others. And so I came up with a magic number of 17, and I kind of figured that was enough. And the 17 contradictions then was a way of starting to look at this dynamic of capital accumulation and its destabilizing possibilities. In this, I found actually some very interesting features, because one of the things, as I've always discovered as a writer, is that you start off writing something thinking you know what it is you want to write. And by the time you get to the end, you've written something completely different. And this is actually one of the wonderful things about writing. I mean, it's sometimes one of the very frustrating things about writing and drives you mad. But at the same time, it is absolutely fascinating. And one of the things I found was that these contradictions locked together in certain very interesting ways, and that you could not actually understand one contradiction without understanding its relationship to other contradictions. Just to begin with the most obvious contradiction that occurs on page 1 of Capital, the contradiction between use value and exchange value. A commodity has a dual character. And we regard the commodity differently, whether we're thinking about it in terms of its use value or its exchange value. And we do different things with it on its use value and exchange value. And in the book, I use the example of housing, kind of saying, well, housing is a use value, describe that in all sorts of different ways. In our society, it also has an exchange value. And we've been told again and again and again that actually the most efficient way in which use values can be provided to a population is by creating an exchange value system which actually then drives the production of the use values. And this is the most efficient way to provide housing. And of course, this all went terribly, terribly wrong in 2007, 2008. The exchange value system absolutely destroyed the access of housing to something like 14 million households in the United States. 14 million households lost their houses. It was a huge transfer of wealth and asset wealth. Certain vulnerable populations, African Americans, Hispanic migrants, lost vast amounts of their asset wealth. Calculations are that those populations lost about 80%, 70% of their asset wealth. This was a phenomenal loss. At the same time, the Wall Street bankers were pulling in bonuses of billions of dollars. So this is the huge transfer, and this is what the exchange value system was doing. The result was use values were not being provided. But when you look back, you saw very clearly that the bottom half of the population in the United States has never been provided with adequate use values in housing by the exchange value system that had been constructed after the 1930s onwards. In fact, it is a class-biased system. But that exchange value, use value contradiction cannot be dealt with outside of the contradiction between value, which is the social labor which we do for each other as mediated through the market system, and its measure, which is money. And there's a contradiction between value and its representation. But clearly, exchange value doesn't mean anything unless there is a monetary form of representation. So exchange value and use value cannot be understood independent of the contradiction between value and its representative, the money form. Furthermore, the money form does not make sense unless there is private property. And private property cannot exist without its guarantor, which is the state. So you get the state-private property contradiction, which supports the monetary value contradiction, which supports the exchange value, use value contradiction. Furthermore, there's something very, very interesting about the monetary representation. See, social labor is a social relation. And social relations have no direct measure, which is why you need a measuring rod, i.e. the monetary system. And this monetary system has a certain character, in that it is, like all representations, it falsifies at the same time as it represents. The classic example of this for we geographers is, of course, the map. The map represents, but it also distorts and falsifies. And you have to know what it distorts and what it falsifies in order to really use it as a representation. I mean, you've all seen those map projections, right, where the world is sort of divided up into those weird segments, like segments of an orange and spread out on a table. Well, if the world was actually like that, I mean, that would be ridiculous. but that is a valid representation of the world, according to certain mathematical principles. And as we know, there are certain distortions that make certain parts of the world look much larger than other parts of the world. The Mercator protection makes Greenland look like one of the biggest pieces of territory on the Earth, which of course it's not. So the map distorts at the same time as it represents. Money distorts at the same time as it represents. And one of its big distortions is that it allows the private appropriation of social wealth. And the private appropriation of social wealth, of course, underpins the accumulation of wealth on the part of significant elements in the population that can then, of course, form a capitalist class. So you see these contradictions relating to each other and supporting each other and working with each other. And the contradictions have this habit of getting out of control. I've mentioned the use value, exchange value contradiction, which actually lay at the root of the crisis of 2007-2008 in housing markets. But that would not make sense if you didn't have the contradiction in the monetary form, so that speculative activity and monetary applications and fictitious capital flying through housing markets played a very important role in the formation of that crisis, as also did the contradictory relationship between state and private property, as did the class relation. So here is, if you like, the sense in which I was developing these ideas of contradictions. And in so doing, we started to demonstrate that we could start to distinguish between certain contradictions which are foundational for how capital works. That is, the use value, exchange value contradiction is going to be there in any capitalist society. Doesn't matter what time or place. But this is rather different from some other contradictions which are highly changeable over time. For instance, the contradictions that surround technology are constantly evolving. The evolution of new technologies and technological dynamics. And technological dynamism is no longer something which is forced by competition between individuals, because technological dynamism has itself become big business. Marx comments on this. It means that actually there is a whole sector of our economy that is actually working constantly to produce new technologies, whether we need them or not. And very often what happens is the new technologies come on board and there's not a use for them, so a use has to be created, a need has to be created. And it's not only true of new technologies, it's also true of new products. When the drug Prozac came on the market, there was no disease to fit it. So they had to actually invent a disease to fit the product. And then everybody got sick from the disease because they liked taking Prozac. And we got what's known as the Prozac generation. So these are the sorts of dynamics which go on, which are about need creation and the like. Now that dynamism leads into what I call a study of the moving contradictions. But one of the things you immediately find is that these moving contradictions and the foundational contradictions coming together often lie at the root of crises. And this was another reason why it seemed to me important to take up the theme of contradiction, because Marx, on many, many occasions, said, when you see a contradiction, what you're seeing is the emergence of the underlying contradictions of capital coming to the surface. And that therefore, if you want to understand crisis and crises, you have to understand the contradictions which are working. So this then permitted me to start to look and ask the question, what were the contradictions involved in the crisis of 2007-2008? And to some degree I had already unpacked that in the enigma of capital, but I was able to confirm much of what I said there through the study of the contradictions. But it then leads, I think, into the fundamental question. To what degree are the contradictions of capital reaching a point at which they are unsustainable? Because there are two ways you can look at capital and contradictions. On a couple of occasions, Marx looks at the contradictions as fatal to the future of capital. But most of the time he doesn't use that language. Contradictions and the crises that accompany their emergence are in fact moments of reconfiguration of what capital is about. They're a moment when capital sheds its skin and absorbs and becomes a new beast, as it were. And looking back, you can see that the 1930s was a period of crisis which produced a new form of capitalism after 1945 in particular. That system ran into crisis in the 1970s. That then came center of another crisis, which produced, through neoliberalization, a new kind of capitalist order, which ran into difficulties several times, by the way, in the late 1990s, 2000s, 2007, 2008, and is still in that crisis in many respects. So the contradictions then help us understand how capitalism changes itself. That is, in what ways capital moves across its contradictions and reconfigures them in the course of a crisis to generate a new form of capitalist endeavor. But are there, the question then poses, certain contradictions which at this historical moment are dangerous to the point where they clearly threaten the continuity of a capitalist system? In Marx's day, you would have said there were certain contradictions, particularly that between capital and labor and the like, which were potentially extremely dangerous for the future of capital. But capital learned how to deal with them and deal with that contradiction. And through various phases after 1930s and after the 1970s, has in a sense settled for itself the labor question. Labor is not in a position at this point to challenge the hegemony of capital, not at all. In fact, it's probably weaker now than it was in 1840 or 1850. Not in all parts of the world, but globally it is in very bad shape. So that is not the contradiction which is going to bring capital down, which disappoints all of my friends in the Socialist Workers' Party and the Revolutionary Socialist Party and everything else, because labor is supposed to do that. And if you say, there's no way it's going to do that, it's like, oh my God, I have no reason to live. And to which I reply, you have very good reason to militate and struggle, because there are certain very dangerous contradictions at the current moment. And at the end of 17 contradictions, I list 3 of them. The first is this notion of endless compound growth. Historically, capital has grown on the average at 2.25% per year on a compound rate. When you look at the press and you look everywhere else, you find that 3% rate of growth is acceptable. 4 or 5%, you're going very well. And if you're like China, of course, you're going at 7 or 8% now, 10% earlier. But 3% compound growth, what does it mean? A compound growth produces an exponential growth path in which you start slowly and then you reach an inflection point and then you go zoom. We seem to be at an inflection point. There was a crisis in the 1970s. It was met by a vast expansion of capital accumulation, by the integration of China into the global system, by the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the integration of all of those countries into the system. The global labor force from 1980 to now has increased by 1 billion people. This is a huge, huge expansion, both in terms of market, but also in terms of labor power. But if you kind of say, capital expanded during this period only at a relatively low rate of growth, it was less than 2% globally from about 1970s to the present. In other words, in spite of that vast physical expansion of the capitalist system, capital still failed to grow very adequately. And it wasn't only doing it by geographical expansion, it was also doing it through an incredible expansion of urbanization. Urbanization worldwide picked up, again, at an exponential rate of growth. It's very interesting traveling around Turkey, just looking at all those parts of the cities which have been constructed over the last 10, 15 years. Anywhere around the world, you see the same thing. I went to Salvador in Brazil. I was there in 1973, and I remember it very well from then. Now it's a completely different city. High-rises all along the beachfront, shopping malls, highways, you name it. And you say to yourself, okay, that's occurred in the last 15 years. Imagine another 60 years of this, or 100 years of this. And there are some phenomenal data about urbanization in China. The estimate is that China has consumed more cement in the last 3 years than the United States consumed in the whole of the last century. That is, capital is surviving by growing at a phenomenal physical rate, which is going to cover the whole earth with cement, probably in the next 15 years, unless you watch out. This is just one example. So the big question is, how can you keep compound growth going in a situation where, even with that huge expansion of China, and to some degree South Asia and ex-Soviet bloc joining the capitalist system, in spite of that huge expansion, capital could not find room to grow. So one of the things it did after the 1970s was not to put money into actually making things, even though it has done a tremendous amount of making of things in urbanization, but increasingly it put its money into assets. It speculated on land values. The capitalist class, the upper echelons, speculated on Picassos and the art market. So the whole capital starts to move towards speculation in asset values. And as it moves to speculation in asset values, more and more people start to try and live off rents. Because one of the assets which also suddenly becomes valued is intellectual property rights. So the United States is vigorously pursuing, through the Trans-Pacific agreements and transatlantic agreements, vigorously pursuing the whole kind of notion of ensuring the rate of return on intellectual property rights. So we have this huge transformation going on, which is not about making things, but about possessing things and then using their scarcity value to speculate on their value. Hardly surprisingly, the crash of 2007 and 2008 was focused on asset values in property markets. That was its root in the United States, and to some degree, of course, also in Spain, Ireland, elsewhere. And I recall being asked on TV program in this country a couple of years ago, what did I think about what I saw in Turkey? And I said, it looks to me like Spain 5 years ago. That is, Spain was involved in this huge property market speculative boom. There's a lot of signs of that, it seems to me, in Turkey. Speculative boom, of course, in China is absolutely phenomenal. Housing prices have been shooting up and then crashing, and new financial institutions are being set up, just as they were, by the way, in Second Empire Paris, which is why looking back is also sometimes extremely useful. So this is, if you like, the problem. How can you accommodate compound growth in a world that is increasingly finite in terms of the possibilities of finding productive investments? And I do some calculations in the book, which you can look at, as to what this would mean in terms of what level of productive investment would have to be accommodated in years to come. So we're at this inflection point. This was not something that bothered Marx. When capital was really confined to what was going on in Britain and the United States and a few parts of Europe, plenty of space to move into, plenty of opportunities to do new things. Not a problem. That was a time when the compound growth rate was not an issue. Today it is, I think, the crucial issue, because it also connects with the second dangerous contradiction, which is the environmental question. How can you actually start, given what I've mentioned about pouring cement everywhere in China to an urbanization? Everybody kind of says, well, we want sustainable urbanization. And you look at almost every city I've seen in Turkey and you say, you call this sustainable urbanization? It's nowhere near it. Absolutely nowhere near it. In fact, it's a violation. I mean, I was in Izmir last October, and you kind of go from there to the coast, and it's just one ghastly kind of second house after another. I mean, qualities of urbanization. I mean, you're not the only place to do this, by the way. You're copying the United States. I mean, the United States is appalling on this. So the environmental question is also a serious one. I'm a little nervous about all these apocalyptic statements that kind of say, well, there's going to be a crash, all the ice caps are going to melt and the sea levels are going to rise, and all sorts of new diseases are going to come up. I mean, there are these apocalyptic tales. I don't agree with that, and I think that actually, historically, capital has been very sophisticated in the way in which it's overcome environmental constraints and dealt with environmental difficulties. And the way it does it, of course, is it turns environmental technologies into big business. It turns environmental remediation into big business. And there is already a very large sector which is doing exactly that. So we see that. But then the third issue, which actually follows on from the second, because I don't think the relation to nature and the environmental issue, in the end, is a technical problem. It's, I think, an aesthetic, social, and I think, in the end, a kind of very human problem. That to the degree that we view nature and the natural world as purely instrumental to our own needs, we become alienated from it. And this leads into the last notion, which is the universal alienation, which attaches to the fact that capital, through commodity production, defines a condition of alienation. And that condition of alienation becomes the more universal, the deeper that capital roots itself in social change. It's very hard to think these days of meaningful jobs. It's hard to construct a meaningful life. And I think the loss of meaning, which has come about through the new technologies of the labor process, through the new technologies of consumption, that the loss of meaning becomes in itself a destabilizing factor in the way in which the world works. This then leads, I think, to the question as to why is it that most of the protests which we've seen, including the protest in Gezi Park, most of the protests we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years have actually been, on the mass scale, about the qualities of urban life and the qualities of urban living. This was what was at stake in 2013 in Brazil. This is what has led to riots in London, riots in Stockholm. It led, of course, to the occupation movement. It's been expressed, I think, again and again in much of the ultra-globalization movement. So that we have, as it were, a zone of politics which is closer and closer to thinking about trying to construct an unalienated form of living in the midst of a world which is increasingly alienated both from nature but also from fellow human beings. So the Gezi process, as I understood it, or understand it, had a lot to do with the search for an unalienated way of being, not simply about, stop this ridiculous business of building a shopping mall, it was far, far more than that. And the same has been true of many urban protests. Which leads me then to the question of how do we think about the relationship between urban protests and its relationship to the traditional forms of protest which have been based on the workplace. And interestingly, there's a simple answer to that, which can be defined out of Marx's theory. Marx likes to talk about what he calls the contradictory unity between production and realization of value. Now, the trouble with reading Marx is that Volume 1 is a very readable book. It's a fantastic book. It's a literary masterpiece. And you can get overwhelmed with it. It's absolutely great. Volume 2 is a monumental bore. Volume 1 is about the production of value. Volume 2 is about the realization of value through circulation. If Marx is right, and you cannot understand capital without understanding the contradictory unity between production and realization, which is the 7th contradiction in 17 contradictions, if you cannot do that, then you cannot understand Marx's theory without understanding the beautiful book, Volume 1, and the incredibly boring book, Volume 2. The trouble is, most Marxists don't read Volume 2. And if they do, they read it once and then say, oh, God, put it aside. What I tried to do in the companion is to say, don't do that, because you're not understanding the theory if you do that. And it's unfortunate, but we've got to wade through Volume 2 to actually understand the totality of what Marx is talking about. Because Volume 2 is looking at realization of value, and it does it in a very interesting way, which I haven't got time to go through in any detail. But one of the features that comes out of Volume 2 is that the production of value doesn't necessarily coincide in space and time with the realization of that value, which is an obvious thing to say. So you have to ask the question, where is the value produced and where is it realized? And who produces it and who realizes it? Let me give you an example. Apple computers. The production of value in Apple computers is basically done by Foxconn in China. And as far as we know, the rate of return on capital in Foxconn is 3%. So the direct producers get 3% of rate of return on their capital. Apple Computer, that sells the stuff in the United States, gets a rate of return of 27%. So here you have a situation in which production of value which occurs in China is realized in the United States. And this is actually what contemporary imperialism is very much about. That the transfer of value through this realization process becomes absolutely critical. And the transfer of value means that actually what we're witnessing is a relationship between industrial capitalists or producer capitalists and merchant capitalists. And actually right now, merchant capitalists are doing very well. So some of the biggest billionaires in the world are Walmart, the Walton family of Walmart, and of course they're merchant capitalists. And they actually organize the production and put the screws on the producers, so very low rate of return over there. Walmart does extremely well. You name all of the other stores, IKEA, etc., all doing the same. So merchant capital is actually a very important role to play. And to some degree, it can monopolize consumer markets. And as it does so, it can extract. And the same applies to something like housing, that a large amount of wealth is being extracted from housing markets by property owners. I don't know if this is true where you live, but where I live in New York City, finding a place to live on an ordinary salary is almost impossible. 50% of the population of New York City tries to live on less than $30,000 a year. They cannot find housing anywhere in the metropolitan area. And if you ask the question, is the same true in London? Is the same true in Istanbul? Is the same true? The same is true everywhere. And then there's a very interesting thing. You then look and see, well, what kinds of things are the housing market building? They're building condominiums for the very rich. But are they building condominiums for the very rich to live in? No, the very rich are buying them to invest in. So we have all of these condominiums in New York City which are empty. Because people from the Gulf states or so on want to invest in them. And you go around at night and you take a look, how many lights on? Very interesting. A lot of them are empty. Whole streets in London are unoccupied in the midst of a housing crisis of affordable housing for the mass of the population. So you get this crazy kind of extractions of wealth going on. Accumulation by dispossession, I call it, as was true of the foreclosures. And that accumulation by dispossession, a lot of it is occurring in urban environments. Furthermore, when you look at the structure that Marx lays out of the circulation of revenues and the circulation of capital in Volume 2, what you see is this. Now let's suppose that the workers struggle like crazy to get higher wages and better working conditions in the workplace. And let's suppose they're victorious and they get a 50% increase in their wages. They put the 50% 50% increase of wages in their pocket. They take it home with them, and then what do they find? The landlord increases the rent by 50%. The telephone company starts to put extra charges. The credit card company suddenly ups its charges. And all of that completely disappears back to the bourgeoisie through exploitation at the point of realization. Now, it's not fashionable in Marxist circles to talk about the exploitation that occurs at the point of realization, and to say that is just as dangerous and just as difficult for everybody's lives as is the exploitation that occurs at the point of production. The contradictory unity between production and realization is significant, because exploitation occurs at both ends. And this is Marx's genius in Volume 2, to look at the circulatory process and to ask questions about where is it coming from, where is it going to, and where is wealth extraction going on. And increasingly what we see is that the bourgeoisie is extracting wealth at the point of realization at a faster and faster rate relative to what it's extracting from workers at the point of production. So that there's a unity between those two. But it's an awkward unity for the very simple reason. And that is that the relationship between, at the point of realization, is really a relationship between people who are being dispossessed and those who are doing the dispossessing. And the relationship between the dispossessors and the dispossessed is not the same class relation as the relation between capital and labor at the point of production. It muddles things, because it turns out bourgeois, middle class, even upper class people can be expropriated at the point of realization. They too have problems with rising property prices. They too. So there's not a clear kind of capital versus labor. There is a dispossessed relation. And how does that map onto the capital-labor struggle? And how do we unify them? That is part of what the contradictory unity is between production and realization of value and surplus value. So you may say, oh, it gets too complicated. But actually, I find this extremely useful. It explains to me what the relationship might be between something like what happened in Gezi Park, or what happened in the Occupy movement, or what happened elsewhere, and the traditional labor movement. That is, it says, given Marx's theory, you would expect there to be an equal emphasis upon struggles around realization as there are struggles around production. And that, therefore, a political movement has to say, I'm not simply only going to be concerned with workers and the point of production. A political movement has to start to say, I'm going to be equally concerned with conditions of production and the conditions of realization. Because if we don't pay attention to what's going on in the field of realization, we will not see something which is vital. And this is why what happened in the United States around foreclosures was so dramatic. I mean, 14 million people, households, dispossessed of their housing. What happened to that housing? Hedge funds and private equity companies started to move in, buy it all up, and rent it out. This was a huge, huge transfer of wealth from those who could least afford it to those who didn't need it. And if you look at it that way, what you see immediately is that this should be at the center of what class struggle is about. We don't do what leftists have often done, which is to say, well, that's a secondary kind of question. That's a secondary form of exploitation. I mean, Engels started that in his otherwise extremely interesting book on the housing question by saying, basically, Well, we'll get to those questions only after we've taken care of the production question. In Marx and Engels' day, that might have made some sense. It does not make sense anymore. It does not make any sense to construct a theory, which Marx constructed, of capital accumulation, as if consumerism does not matter. In Marx's day, consumerism accounted for about 30% of what was going on in the economy. Today in the United States, it's around 75% of what's going on in the economy. You can't have a theory that says that's irrelevant. You've got to bring it back in. And you can do it, given the way Marx set up an understanding of the circulation of capital, and the way he set up this idea of the contradictory unity between production and realization. This contradictory unity means a relationship between urban struggles and work-based struggles. And I think that in certain countries of the world right now, Brazil being a very good example, the opportunity exists to create a politics around both of those questions, and a unitary politics. They have some very, very fine social movements around questions of housing. They have some good movements around questions of employment and labor. And I think here too in Turkey, you can see very clearly that it's not only questions of production, but also questions of realization that are absolutely crucial. Now, this is, I think, one of the reasons why, when you look at the three dangerous contradictions right now, and then you start to look at the details of each contradiction and how they work, what you see is the emergence of a political agenda which I think actually starts to make sense. And some of this came to me, of course, in teaching Marx's Capital, because I was teaching it to students, some of whom had experience in the workplace, but most of whom did not. But if you say, are you having trouble finding a place to live for $800 a month? And they'd say, oh yeah. Are you having trouble with your credit card company, your telephone company? And oh yeah. In other words, the field of realization, where people are really being hit hard. And this also, of course, is where intellectual property rights starts to come in, of what you have to pay. I had to pay the other day to get one of my own articles from a learned journal. And you kind of say, this is ridiculous. So these are the sorts of struggles that need to be unified. And yes, it makes it more complex, but I think the theoretical framing that is made possible by a study of Marx's contradictions provides a certain overarching unity to what a political program might look like that can really go after the big, big question as to what the end of capitalism might look like and why it is so crucial to think about the end of capitalism right now. And in so doing, I think it's important also to accept that actually capital is extremely resilient and capital is completely unmoved by any humanist concerns or interests. Capital can survive in the most appalling ways that you can imagine. And it's up to us as human beings, it seems to me, to sort of start to pose and ask, where is the alternative? And what shall the alternative look like? And there are some simple answers, which I suggest at the end of 17 Contradictions. We should be looking for a society that provides adequate use values to all, and we should minimize the capacity of anybody to extract wealth from the exchange value system in the provision of those use values. we've been through 30 years of privatization in which, for example, healthcare, education, housing have all become commodities to be traded, in the United States at least. And to the degree they have, it means that actually the provision of those use values, which used to be free, has become actually commodified. We need to take things in the other direction. Housing should be seen as a human right, not as a commodity. Healthcare should be seen as a human right, not a commodity. Education, higher education, and the like, should all be seen as human rights, not as commodities. And we can move society in that direction, which is, as it were, a revolutionary direction, because the more we move in that direction, the less space there is for capital to accumulate. In the end, I hope that the capitalists will be left with only one thing to accumulate, that is speculating in the art market, in which case they would all be sitting there with millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars, all kind of saying, I'm going to spend $2 trillion on this Picasso, versus you'll spend $3 trillion, and they can play that game. We'll have the rest of society organized in a much more sensible way around use values. Similarly about the relationship between production and realization. A feudal economy was based on needs, human needs, and the production of value was secondary. We've inverted that, and the production of value is now primary, and we define and redefine human needs as those things which have to be constructed in order to absorb that production. We have to reverse that and go back to a needs-based society, one which is not driven by the production and of value and surplus value. So by thinking through those things, you have a framework. It's not a program, it's a framework for thinking about where we might drive towards in constructing an alternative. So what I hope to have done is to define, as an anti-capitalist, you have to move in one or other direction around these contradictions. And as an anti-capitalist, you have to start to pursue a political agenda which is around the reduction of the power of exchange value vis-à-vis use value, the reduction of the power of production of value and surplus value vis-à-vis realization and human needs, the inversion of that. These are the sorts of moves we need to make. And it's not beyond our wit and our understanding to be able to make them. In other words, it is, in the end, quite simple. But the simplification comes about only, it seems to me, through a proper theoretical elaboration of what the contradictions of capital are really all about. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions. I guess we do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions actually.
You may have to speak up. Or is there a microphone that we can find? I guess not. But anyway, you'll have to speak up. Oh yeah, there's a microphone back there. Okay, so you'll go next. Okay, right.
Teşekkürler.
Oh, sorry.
Refik Ünal, toplumsal üretimin kapitalist biçimi içerisinde emek gücü metası geçim araçlarıyla ya da ücretle değişmekten özgürleşebilir mi ya da nasıl özgürleşebilir? Sorun bu kadar. Teşekkürler.
Yeah, one of the contradictions, there's a lot of work that goes on in society which is outside of the commodity realm. It's non-wage labor. This is typically, of course, household labor, but it's not only household labor. You will find a lot of work of this kind going on in the peer-to-peer computing community. In other words, there is a large zone already of non-wage labor. In the past, one of the disagreements I had with some feminists who wanted to actually have wages paid for housework is I think that that's the wrong way around. You actually then end up trying to commodify that which is not commodified. We should be actually taking the principles of household labor and actually moving it in the other direction so that less and less labor becomes wage labor and more of it becomes organized along the principles of collective provision on a non-wage basis. This, to some degree or other, can be accomplished by, of course, setting up of practices of commoning and organizing common resources. It can also be set up by not so much worker cooperatives that are embedded within the capitalist system, but solidarity economies and the like. In other words, there is a way in which we can start to think about the extension of the principles of household labor into the economy more generally, so that we become less and less dependent upon the wage-labor relation as being crucial. Now, that's obviously going to take a long time, given the international division of labor and our dependency on a very complicated international division of labor. This is not going to be something that can be done overnight, but I see many aspects of this common labor commoning, if you want to call it that, like I say, in the computer community, where a lot of work is being done which is unwaged and which does not rely upon wage labor at all for producing something which is very, very constructive and helpful for human life and living. Yeah.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. One leads to the other, actually. The fact that, in a way, we're all capitalists because, for example, a new Mongolian mine is opening, and the Ontario Pension Fund has invested in the company who's doing the mining, an Australian company. But I'm wondering about also entropy and the second law of thermodynamics in capitalism, because entropy as the uncertainty increases, the energy and randomness and uncertainty increases, and we can see with your three chronic, critical contradictions of alienation, environmental contradiction, and endless compound growth, that it seems that we're reaching that ultimate state of entropy. And I just have also something I need to get cleared up. Is it true equilibrium is the perfect state of disorder? And maybe we're reaching that equilibrium? And that it's possible that capitalism could actually implode? Considering the laws of thermodynamics?
Yeah, I've been in some fights over the question of the applicability of the second law of thermodynamics to understanding our present condition. It is, of course, true that at a certain point the sun will burn out, the universe may come to an end, but that's an incredibly long way off. As Prigogine and Stengers pointed out in their book on Order Out of Chaos, there are two major lines of thinking in the sciences. One of them is based in physics, which is about first and second laws of thermodynamics. The other is an evolutionary process, in which, far from being the world moving towards greater and greater states of disorder, it becomes more and more organized. In fact, the evolutionary trend is towards concentration of wealth and monopoly power and all the rest of it within capital. So I don't agree with those who kind of point to the second law of thermodynamics as somehow or other being terribly relevant to our present condition. It is relevant within closed systems, but the Earth is not a closed system as far as energy is concerned. The energy flow is still coming from the sun, and there's no sign of that abating right now. And when it does, eons from now, then of course some generation way up there is going to have to worry about that, but I'm not going to be worried about that right now. What we're dealing with, however, is the increasing production of nature by human activity. That is, we are evolutionary agents, we always have been, and our impacts have been extremely strong and powerful historically. When human beings discovered the power of fire, for example, they set fire to all kinds of things, and they completely changed the transformation of things. When they domesticated things, they took sheep and goats to the New World, and soon the vegetation of the New World is completely reconfigured. So we have been evolutionary agents with massive impacts upon environment, so there's no such thing around anymore as a, quote, a natural environment. All the environments we live in are humanly constructed, but some of them are even more dramatically so now when we're looking at, say, the urbanization of Dubai and the like. So one of the things we're looking at is the production of nature, and what kind of nature we produce is, of course, the nature we're going to have to live with, which brings me back to urbanization. The kind of cities we produce are the kind of environments we're going to have to live in. And to the degree that these environments are less and less comfortable to live in, actually involve us, a lot of us, in very hard work to actually live in them adequately. So there is a very serious kind of question of the direction of evolutionary transformation which human beings are imparting through their technological capacities and powers, and through their, modification of the environment. I mean, I'm always impressed when I fly around the world and upset people because I like to look out the window and see what I see outside, and people tell me to put my blind shut because it interferes with their watching a movie. I kind of say it's much more interesting what you see out there. If you're flying over Greenland or something like that, and somebody told me to shut the window because to hell with you, There was nearly a fight on the airplane. But I think but what's dramatic is, of course, the degree of human interventions, and how those human interventions rest on certain technologies which have all sorts of consequences. For example, contemporary urbanization could not exist without refrigeration. Food supply in a city is foundational. There's no way you could give food supply to a population of 25 million without having adequate refrigeration. And as we know, many vaccines and things like this require refrigeration. If you don't keep them refrigerated, they're powerless. So actually, we depend on refrigeration in all sorts of ways. But of course, refrigeration depended upon chlorofluorocarbons and gave us the ozone hole, and so we had to find a substitute. And so there are all these contradictions within the technology and the lifestyle and the environmental aggregates. So I think that those are the sorts of things we should be looking at and concerned with. And as I say, I don't really get into, I don't rate very high the whole kind of question of second law of thermodynamics is somehow or other something which is terribly relevant to what's happening. I mean, as Alfred North Whitehead said about the pyramids, eventually they're made up of molecules that will dissolve, but the pyramids have been there for a very long time, and they'll probably be there for a very long time into the future. So it's not. So I tend not to think in those terms. As for the fact we're all capitalists, well, in some ways that's precisely the point of what I'm trying to talk about. That we're all embedded within the contradictions of capital. We don't have any choice about that. The only thing we can do is to say, I'm on this side of the contradiction rather than that side of the contradiction. I want to manage these contradictions so that we push things in this direction rather than that direction. We've been through 30 years of pushing them in that direction. We need a big, hefty push back in the other direction. And I cannot escape the contradictions that surround us, and I think that's part of why 17 Contradictions is for me a very important book, because it actually displays where the contradictions are, what the contradictions are that you have to live with, and then what positionality you might want to take politically in relationship to these contradictions.
Teşekkür ederiz geldiğiniz için. Benim bir sorum Rojava üzerine olacaktı. Antikapitalizm bir sistemin yaratılma mücadelesini ve alternatif bir yaşamı gerçekleştirme mücadelesi örneği olarak Rojava'yı nasıl değerlendiriyorsunuz? Ve tüm bu konuşulanların sonunda Rojava'nın yeniden inşa süreci için ne söyleyebilirsiniz?
Yeah, I wish I'd had an opportunity to find out far more about it. I tried to get in there and couldn't get in there for a variety of reasons, about which I was very sorry, and I would like to know a lot more about it. What I would say is that I've always, as a geographer, respected what is the radical tradition in geography, which is anarchism, not Marxism. And I've always had, therefore, a certain kind of respect for certain lines of anarchist thinking. And that certainly includes the work of Murray Bookchin, who I've referred to a number of times. And like, I think, in Rebel Cities, I pointed out that I thought that his was one of the most imaginative schemas for handling certain issues about managing the commons, and I've been very supportive about trying to bring Murray Bookchin's ideas forward. To the degree that these have become become influential in some way in Rojava, I would think that this is a very positive development. I would want to know exactly how it's working on the ground. I know the theory of it. I read accounts of it. But I've been around long enough to know that accounts of what's going on don't always match so well with what's actually going on. So, like I say, I wish I had an opportunity to see it firsthand and try to talk it firsthand with those who are attempting to institute these new structures of governance and governmentality, which are not only, I think, of concern in Rojava, but also, I think, in Ahmed and other parts of northern Kurdistan. So, yeah, I have very positive feelings about it, but I really am not in a position to judge. To what degree would I want to talk about the reconstruction of the Rojava area? I think there are a number of, again, I wish I'd had the chance to consult more with some of the people involved in the reconstruction. There is, I think, a very interesting experiment going on right now in Gaza, of all places. A group of people have got together to try to redesign urbanization in Gaza on different urbanistic principles, including some of these governance structures. So I would be very, I have a very positive view of this, but again, I'm not really in a position to kind of say, hey, it's great, it's all working or anything, because, you know. So I just hope that it is allowed to flourish. I think there's a clear danger to it all of the time, of course. And I think that it deserves to flourish. And I would hope to see, you know, given the complexities of the positionality of the current Turkish government vis-à-vis the PKK and vis-à-vis the Kurdish movement and so on, and given all the other complexities that exist in this region, I can see that it's going to be hard work to try and keep it open. And I think that to the degree that international support can be mobilized in support of what is happening in Rojava, I would kind of say that we should do whatever we can to try to support the possibilities which are being explored there.
Hello. First, I want to thank you for coming to Istanbul and give us this great speech. Thank you very much. I have two questions to ask. First, I think we are currently facing a contradiction about organization in terms of politics. I mean, you know the Gezi resistance in Turkey and these new type of horizontal forms of resistance organization, forums as we call them, or neighborhood solidarities, etc. And this is emerging in the face of these old forms of political organizations. I mean, and I guess you also follow the resistance of workers in Bursa. There is a kind of resistance against the old forms of political organization. What do you think about these newer, recent forms of political resistance, let's say? And my second question is about the more moderate forms of opposition. I mean, we have the elections now, and we have these opposition parties which promises a lot of things that we mostly know that they won't be able to do them. I mean, it's sometimes even difficult to fight these moderate forms of, I mean, social democratic or democratic in USA or labor in UK. I mean, do you have any recommendations or thoughts about these two, we may say them, contradictions as well? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm on record of being a bit of a critic of what seems to me a dogmatic interest in pure horizontalism as a form of organization. I think it has limited capacities and powers. I've also observed enough of anarchist meetings and the like to know that even though they always like to talk about horizontality, they are in fact riddled with hierarchy. And I think that there is this difficulty of the autonomist, anarchist kind of tendency to say that there is only this one form of organization. I mean, I'm in favor of pluralistic approaches to organizational forms, which is why I think Bookchin's kind of comments about confederalism and the clear bringing together of local democratic institutions into some broader configuration, and how that is done and the like is, I think, absolutely critical. So I think there is there's been a bit of a fight on the left between the traditional forms of political organization and the new forms of political organization, which, you know, contrast, if you like, pure horizontality with pure democratic centralism. I'm not in favor of either. I think that actually we need to think about organizational forms, particularly given the argument I made about the relationship between production and realization of value. The organizational forms which you require to mobilize the dispossessed are rather different from those needed to mobilize workers in a factory. There are some new organizational forms growing up in the United States with fast food workers and precarious workers, which are different from traditional trade union structures, but are becoming increasingly militant and operate outside of traditional structures for the very simple reason that trade union law in the United States doesn't allow for the kinds of militancy that is really needed in these times. So I think that the open exploration of different organizational forms is going on, but it's hindered, if you like, by these rather dogmatic assertions on the part of certain elements of the left. But I think there's no question whatsoever that a new way of doing politics is emerging, and this new way of doing politics is, of course, one which is outside of traditional political parties. But again, that means that if you stay entirely outside of the state and you don't want to have anything to do with traditional political parties, you leave yourself vulnerable to state action. And that dismantling and demobilizing the state apparatus by electoral means seems to me to be a very important aspect of any political program. Now, and if you kind of say to me, well, they're all the same, you know, I've been there in a way, and I would just like to point out that the election in which George Bush illegally, it turns out, defeated Al Gore has had actually world-shaking circumstances. Al Gore would not have invaded Iraq. And I think that, you know, if you kind of say, what are the consequences of George Bush getting elected instead of Al Gore, was it gave the neoconservatives an opportunity they've been lusting for about 30 years before that, which was to invade Iraq. And they did. And, you know, I won't say that everything that's followed is a consequence of that, but much of the mess we're now witnessing has a lot to do with that one decision and that those votes in Florida, which if they had been properly counted, and if the Supreme Court had not been in favor of George W. Bush, in the end 9 people elected the President of the United States, and those 9 people elected him, and he went to war in Iraq with all the consequences that have followed. So I don't think that it's reasonable to say it doesn't matter who gets elected. For the most part, it doesn't. I agree. Political parties promise things and don't deliver. It's very disillusioning to live with them. I've had to live with the Obama phenomena for 8 years, and boy, has that been miserable. But on the other hand, I think that I'd rather have Obama than McCain. And this is, I think, a very significant element in a situation. So that's what I would say about that. But I think also what I see, for example, local government is a very important question. I think the fact that, you know, for instance, progressive Kurdish movement has certain power in Ahmed, seems to me to be, you know, significant. So again, that comes about for electoral reasons. What we've seen in the United States just recently is that the federal government refuses to raise the minimum wage, but now about 20 cities in the United States have raised the minimum wage very high. And so there's actually something going on at the local municipal level which is very significant. And it's interesting. This brings me back to Murray Bookchin. Murray Bookchin argued that working electorally at the municipal level is okay. In other words, the state apparatus at the local level was terribly important to capture it and use it constructively. And actually, right now we're seeing some examples of that, both here in Turkey but also in the United States, where cities like Los Angeles and Seattle have had a major impact on the labor market by raising the minimum wage from something like $7 or $8 an hour to $15 an hour. This is not small. This is huge. And this is making a big, big difference to the way in which politics is being worked out in the United States.
Kusura bakmayın, araya ben geliyorum ama programımız gereği son 2 soruyu alacağız arkadaşlar. Ve sonrasında da kendisi de çok yoruldu. Bizler de yorulduk. Daha sonrasında da Sayın David Harvey ile birlikte bir imza törenimiz olacak. Biliyorsunuz bugün Kapitalizmin 17 çelişkisi ve Kapitalizmin Sonu kitabında Türkiye lansmanı günü. Sel Yayıncılık'la birlikte de şu anda kapıda bulunan masada tam auditorium girişinde de kendisi kitaplarını imzalayacak. Buna da fırsat verelim. O nedenle sizden ricamız sadece son 2 soru ve sonrasında da imza töreni.
Okay. Sorayım mı, ne yapayım? Okay, over here, Mr. Harvey. Okay, my question is about the, we were talking about the dogmatic Marxism and how they approach things from a purely labor perspective. But, I agree with you on the dogmatism of Marxism, but the thing is, the political struggles, the kind of political struggles you suggest, don't you think those could lead to pushing capitalism to the corner could create more crisis, and more crisis could legitimize the hegemonic classes to re-legitimize, accumulation by dispossession, further accumulation by dispossession?
Yeah, in principle, it is perfectly possible. I think in many ways, working class movements, particularly in Europe and even in North America, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in addition to working class movements in some other parts of the world, like Latin America, certainly pushed capital towards a particular kind of crisis. But I think that capital then, in effect, went on strike and has since been disciplining the working classes, and by the middle of the 1980s had in effect won its battle against the working class globally. And I think that that is the situation today. That doesn't mean that all of the workers who are in China right now, and the workers in Bangladesh, and the workers in Mexico, and the workers here in Turkey and so on, couldn't theoretically all come together and unite and actually push capital into a corner. And I'm not against that, obviously, but I just don't see that they have the power to do that right now, and I don't see that their either their organization, their legal capacity, or their capacity to mobilize is such as to make that the primary contradiction. If I was giving this talk, say in 1969 or 1970, I would have said that that is one of the dangerous contradictions of capital at that time. But it's the capitalists have got past that right now through globalization, through technological change. And I just give you a simple example. When I went to Baltimore in 1969, a lot of politics was mobilized through the steelworkers, which had something like 37,000 people employed in the steelworks. By the time you get to by 1985, there's only about 15,000 people employed in the steelworks, and by the time you get to 1990, there's only 5,000 people employed in the steelworks, even though it's producing the same amount of steel. which is the technological dynamism which was being deployed. Then, finally, imports defeat it, and so there's no steel produced there at all. So the politics in Baltimore has changed from that of a working class city with strong trade unions to no trade unions at all. The only institutions that defend the rights of the poor are the churches, actually. So it's a civil rights movement, and the churches and the right. And most of the organizations there are human rights organizations, no longer labor organizations. So that's how politics is now being worked out in many US cities. And as you see from a city like Detroit, you know. So yeah, I mean, any of the contradictions we talk about could become dangerous at any historical moment. And back in the 1960s, early 1970s, they were. I'm not saying they could never be again. But right now, I don't see there any danger whatsoever to the capitalist class interests. Okay, last question. Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask about whether you can historicize the scale or the favorable place of action, because everything that you present here is more in a, you could have made the speech in London, in Rio de Janeiro, in Mexico City. But I think you're historicizing now the types of struggle that can come together. You're historicizing contradictions during the time of Marx, during the 70s and now. And can you historicize again, if you historicize the contradictions, what is a favorable, not the geography, but the scale of action? Because when I look at Turkey, exactly what you are saying, you're giving me a framework to understand better what is going on in Turkey in terms of how struggles come together. Not only urban and workplace, but also environmental struggles come together. They are defense-oriented and they are problem-oriented. There is an action that is off to destruct a place, a new nuclear terminal, a power plant, or a workplace, a mass dismissal of people, or anything they are defense-oriented. This is why they are problem-oriented, and they have usually the same actors in front of them. We have some 50 corporations who are buying private universities, who are investing in hospitals, who are investing in power centers, these conglomerate type of capital. Right. So because these actors bring types of struggles together, they are organized around defense, not a new world vision. We are defending a very concrete thing, and they are problem-oriented. So I would have loved to hear if these urban workplace and environmental struggles come together, what could be the favorable geography or the scale action? What defines the locality? How do you diversify your speech when you make it in Mexico City and Turkey? Does it diversify? Can you see the globe in terms of its struggle geography as well, not in terms of its capital geography? And a small question that goes with this: you didn't mention environmental struggles, though they are very
mention what?
Environmental struggles.
Yeah, right,
I think because you see urban
right.
includes all, no? Urban is for you, planetary urbanism. Did I? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I didn't mention environmental struggles, and I didn't mention feminist struggles. I didn't mention queer theory struggles. I didn't mention anti-racist struggles. I didn't mention environmental struggles. This raises some very interesting issues, which, if you want, you can go on my website. I've just written a response on these sorts of issues. Because these other forms of oppression are very important, and of course when you're dealing with urban environments, they come together. You cannot, in the field of social reproduction, disaggregate the questions of what a capital accumulation is about, and what the emancipation of women or emancipation of sexually differentiated groups or ethnic groups or religion and nation and all the rest of it. In other words, one of the main things I'm talking about here is the contradictions of capital, which are very different for me from the contradictions of capitalism. The contradictions of capitalism are much broader, and they sometimes, of course, come together, so that the Kurdish struggle, for example, has a course about emancipation for a particular cultural group, but it also has anti-capitalist elements in it. And what I wanted to do was to try to define what those anti-capitalist elements might be. Not to deny the significance of these other forms of struggle, and how alliances can be built between an anti-racist struggle and an anti-capitalist struggle. That is a very, very important issue in the United States because historically, whenever anti-racist struggles have become anti-capitalist struggles, they become extremely, extremely dangerous for the capitalist system. And I think it's no accident that the main leaders, like Malcolm X and of course Martin Luther King, were assassinated when they started to take that turn from anti-racist struggles and civil rights struggles towards anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggles. So there's that whole set of issues which I haven't dealt with here, which I'm very aware of. And if you, like I say, if you go to my website, I did a brief piece about the dangerous, because I've been criticized for not dealing with those struggles adequately. And my point is that I'm not trying to deal with those struggles here. I'm trying to define what is anti-capitalist, so that those struggles know better what it means to be anti-capitalist, so you don't get the anti-racists saying, oh, I'm anti-capitalist, but then it turns out that actually plenty of anti-racists are pro-capitalist. I know plenty of feminists who are pro-capitalist. I know plenty of queer theorists who are pro-capitalist. So, you know, there's just some distinctions there that need to be thought about and discussed. The question of scale. Look, I give this talk in Mexico City, I give this talk in Santiago, I give it in Rio, and I get very similar responses. And people see what I'm talking about. I think this is about the universality of what capital is about. And while in each case, these other issues like, you know, the questions of race or religion and gender and also come together in a different configuration around this, the basic elements of what is going on. There is not a city that I've been to in the last, you know, 3 or 4 years, and I've been to a lot of them, which doesn't have a sector of building conspicuous consumption type residences for the ultra-rich, that doesn't have at the same time a crisis of affordable housing for the mass of the population. Not a single city I've been to where that has not been a fundamental issue. And when you say, my God, we have that in New York City, people look at you and say, this is strange. And I say, well, it's not strange at all, because the top 1% of people in New York City earn $3.27 million a year, according to the 2012 income tax returns. $3.27 million a year on average, the top 1%. 50% of the population is trying to live on less than $30,000 a year. This is, yeah, well, this then generates a struggle over affordable housing. And then that does get to the electoral arena. You know, can we elect somebody who is sympathetic at least to this question of affordable housing? And we did. We got rid of a billionaire mayor who actually his fantasy was that New York should be the city where every billionaire in the world had a penthouse. Build as many penthouses as you can. Build it in a way, make the city beautiful for them. Don't care about, you know, the homeless. Don't care about the rest of it, except you keep the homeless off the street so you don't see them. So this is the kind of world we live in. And I mean, in Santiago, in Chile, a huge difference between this area they call Little Manhattan and all of the slum dwellers. Same thing. And what were the, you know, revolts in Brazil about in 2013? The state was pouring money into mega projects for the World Cup and the Olympic Games, not providing money for daily life, to improve daily life of the citizens. And people revolted against it. And it's a soccer-mad country, which is absolutely mad at how that is being used to parlay into mega projects. Why is it that worldwide we're actually building cities for people to invest in, not for people to live in? And actually that principle applies in Dubai, it applies in Mumbai, it applies in Santiago, it applies in Sao Paulo. I haven't been to a single city where that's not going on. And then you ask the question, why is this going on in this particular way? And it's going on big, big time in China. Why is it going on? And at that point, you come back to the contradictions of capital and you see why the only way capital can get out of certain of its contradictions right now is to do things like that. And then you say, well, if the only kind of urbanization it can produce is that, then we have to do something different. Now, on the question of scale of action, I'm a great believer in the idea that all politics begins in the locality. It begins in personal daily life. And I don't think you can have any politics that is not rooted in daily life questions, which is why I want to talk about the politics of realization, because that's where people feel it clearly. And everybody feels it in the household, not just simply the person who's working, but everybody, the kids, everything. But that has then to be scaled up in some way. And Marx and Engels had a very interesting formulation in the Communist Manifesto, which I used in Spaces of Hope. And I said, you begin with the personal as political. And it's the personal response to daily life conditions which is political. But at some point, that personal political thing has to come together with others. And in Marx and Engels, it was like people came together in the factory. Well, you don't only come together in the factory, you also come together in the social institutions in a neighborhood, in communities, and so on. So you move to a different level. And so my personal politics and anger at what the landlords are doing is similar to my neighbors. And so there is another level, what you might call the neighborhood level. And then Marx and Engels kind of said, but there are many different factories. And I would say there are many different neighborhoods. An alliance is formed between neighborhoods, and people start to talk about the qualities of urban life for the city as a whole. Now, anarchists are very good at mobilizing in the neighborhood, but they're not very good at talking about how to organize a city as a whole. Murray Bookchin was. He understood very well that unless you could figure out how the water supply worked and how the sewage disposal system worked, you were not going to have a viable city. And somebody has to think about the sewage disposal system for a whole city. So you have to then think about that. You then think about the bioregion and say, well, it's not only my city, but several other cities or several settlements around. So we have to think about the bioregion. How do we organize the bioregion? Can we organize food sovereignty for the city such that the city is basically fed and watered and its garbage disposed of on a bioregional basis? Is there a way to do that? And how do we set up an organizational form that can do that? Notice I'm talking about hierarchies here, and a lot of the left says you can't talk about hierarchies. As soon as you talk about hierarchies, you're a nasty Leninist or Stalinist or something or other. But you've got to have them. And then the bioregions fit into what's going on within a whole territory, like a state, like Turkey or the United States or whatever. How do you put that together? And again, this confederalism idea is important. And then Marx and Engels kind of said, and finally, of course, it means that workers of the world unite. You have to go from all of these scales to elsewhere. So they had this idea of sort of saying, well, we have to have these layers of activity. And one of the things that tended to happen, of course, and Raymond Williams is very good at talking about this, is as you move through these different layers, you get a different politics You get a different vision. You see things clearly at the bioregional level that you don't see at another level. And you need then to talk about how this politics works with that politics. And globally also, we have these issues of global warming or something of that kind. We need to work somehow or other around those issues, so that the scale then becomes significant. And we have to be prepared to think about all of them. But what Marx and Engels did, and what tended to happen, I think, in many left organizations, is that as you moved away from the personal as political to other areas, you forgot that it's a dialectical relation, that you've always got to go back and reaffirm what you're doing, explain what you're doing from the bioregional level to the personal as political. Otherwise, your politics gets hollowed out. It loses its base. It loses its purchase in daily life. And to me, it seems to me that we can think about those different layers. And again, you know, we're not stupid. We're intelligent human beings. We can figure out that issues that arise at the bioregional level are relevant to us, and that we need to do something in our daily lives in order to meet something requirement of what is necessary from the bioregional standpoint or from the global standpoint. We can figure some of those things out. And it's a matter of rational kind of configuration. Again, I'm not an anti-capitalist because I have some defect in my DNA, nor am I anti-capitalist because I've been traumatized by some nasty capitalist who treated me badly or had my mind warped as an infant. In fact, I didn't start reading Capital till I was 35 years old, so there's hope for all of you yet. So we can change these things. And again, thoughtful configuration, reflection on all of these issues is vital for political action, so that we understand where we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it, which is part of what I was trying to do in the 17 Contradictions book. Okay, so I guess that's that. So thank you all very much.
Evet. Kendisine çok teşekkür ediyoruz bu muhteşem ve güzel konferans için. Umarım ki herkes çok keyif aldı ve sizlere de tabii ki bugünkü deneyimi bizlerle paylaştığınız için, buraya kadar geldiğiniz için teşekkür ediyoruz. Ve son bir teşekkür alkışı da bu etkinliği, bu konferansın düzenlenmesine emek verenler. Bu konferans biliyorsunuz 3 ortak aracılığıyla düzenlendi. David'in Türkiye'deki yayıncısı Sel Yayıncılık, Mimar Sinan Güzel Sanatlar Üniversitesi Şehir ve Bölge Planlaması bölümü ve TUMOP Şehir Plancıları Odası İstanbul Şubesi'nden bu etkinliğin düzenlenmesinde emeği geçen tüm arkadaşlarımıza da teşekkür ediyoruz ve onları da burada alkışlıyoruz. Çok sağ olun.